Alright, this is almost certainly going to be the last video I release before Alien Biospheres Part 15. I mean, I'm recording this in September, but I'll probably not release this for another couple of months at least. But whenever it comes out, more than likely, the next time you hear my voice, my great works will finally be done, and I will be free. So whenever that actually happens, I hope to see you all on the other side, including all of the patrons whose generous support makes titanic efforts like this possible in the first place. And now, for what will probably be the last time for quite a while, let's get to work on Tak for Meer. Okay, so even though I only recorded the last episode a few days ago, I still got quite a bit of follow-up for this one. Number one, I have changed the word for black that we coined last time. I originally coined it as sirda, but it occurred to me while I was editing that that does sound a bit like siyah, which is the Turkish word for black. So just to make it a little bit different, I decided to change the vowel. And specifically, I came to the realization that if we say that the initial sound in this word was a palatal ejective, then the ejective causes following vowels to lower, and then later on, after ejectives are lost, the palatal causes following vowels to front. So that means that this sequence, tu, will in the modern line become s, with a front mid-rounded vowel, which I've been looking for more opportunities to get those anyway, so we end up with sirdu. Okay, point number two, this ka suffix that we coined a few episodes back, that turns nouns into adjectives, I came to the realization that this suffix is pretty much always going to be preceded by a vowel, so that Q is therefore pretty much always going to be intervocalic. Now I like the uvula when it's up against a consonant, a sequence like aska, or arka, or anka, those are all quite nice. But when it's intervocalic, I'm not as big a fan of it, and so for purely phonesthetic reasons, I'm thinking of changing that Q to an H, just because I think we could use more intervocalic H's at this point, and I just marginally prefer the sound of it. So to end up with an H in the modern language, we could say the protoform begins with either just a velar fricative or with a pharyngeal. If it's a pharyngeal, it'll cause the following vowel to lower. If it's velar, then it won't. I like the variety of having it sometimes be high, so I think we're going to go with chi as the protoform. Now the only issue with that is that words that happen to end in an H, like this word lich that means friend, or kardach, which means eagle, I'd imagine that the adjectival suffix got affixed on before word final vowel loss, so when you attach this affix you would use the theme vowel, if you like, of whatever declension the noun was in. So that means if we wanted to take the word for friend and turn it into an adjective that meant friendly, that would be lychehi, which is a terrible, terrible word. So I'm thinking we could fix that by either just pulling some phonological reduction or something and say that the H is just blended together, or just saying that this word that was originally a noun that means friend can also just be used as an adjective in and of itself. So lich could either mean friend or friendly one. I don't know, but there'll be some way to get around that, I think. Speaking of which, another thing I was thinking about is this word nilla we have, because last time we were talking about maybe using the word for child as part of a derivational suffix, but we already have this word for child, so I was thinking about, do we have two different words for children, or do they come from different sources, or what have you? And I was thinking we could say that this word that's used to mean child is actually an adjective that means young, so nilla would literally be a young one. But it turns out that may not actually be 100% necessary, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Next point of follow-up, I was thinking more about these various derivational affixes we have while I was editing the last episode, and I think I'm confident in saying at this point that I don't think we need a specific affix for instruments. Like, with our participle strategy, we have ways of describing inanimate things that carry out the action of the verb, which most of the time will convey this same sort of instrumentality that we're looking for, so I don't think it's necessary to have a specific affix for that, so I'm just going to cross that one off. And the participles also cover agent nouns, so we don't need to worry about that either. Patient nouns are a whole other deal, but we'll get to that in due course. Okay, another idea I had. So I usually don't do this, but I'm thinking of maybe having affixes for male and female. Number one, for the simple reason that, to my memory, I don't think I've ever done that in a conlang before, and I'm trying to do things differently. But also, I remember reading a paper at some point, can't remember when or what it was about, but I do remember it brought up the point that having specific markers to specify gender, even outside of the context of an actual grammatical gender system, was surprisingly common cross-linguistically. So even though it's not really a distinction that I particularly care about, like it doesn't really provide very many, radically different derivational possibilities, for some reason it just sort of feels right in this instance. And it also seems pretty overwhelmingly likely that the male suffix should come from this word tolo, that means man, and the female should come from this word sather, which means woman. Now, for both of them, we could justify them either being prefixes or suffixes, because essentially they're just going to compound on to the nouns that they co-occur with, and we can justify either element being the head in that instance. So if you wanted to say like a female, warrior, that could either be a warrior woman or a woman warrior. Either of those would work. And I think in this case I actually prefer the idea that they're prefixes. The word for man could shorten up to just tol, and I think we can get away with the word for woman shortening up to sa. Now what I haven't decided yet is whether or not these two would participate in vowel harmony. Like, are they still seen as just compounds, or have they become sort of true affixes at this point? Dunno, gonna keep on thinking about that. Okay, next point of follow-up, returning to our meronymic, resultative, diminutive, whatever you want to call it, suffix. I had proposed last time this bir suffix, but after it occurred to me that this suffix is likely to end up as an element in personal names a lot of the time, for whatever reason, I just started to think that this particular form wasn't right. I mean, if you've been watching this series for this long, then you should know how fickle I am about these things. But I'm just not a huge fan of names ending in bir or vir. For one thing, we already have a huge number of words that end in r, the second principal part of verbs, the dative forms of nouns, loads of word final r going on. That's the last thing we need. And in fact, we already have a surplus of r's in general, because all of the sibilants at all the various stages in this language's history, they all end up becoming r when surrounded by voice segments. So I had to think for a different form that I might like, and the one that I came up with was, if we had an old word, matu, with an adjective, which for the modern language would give us mat in the human class, and then both the animate and inanimate classes would have to take an additional underspecified low vowel, so like mata. And for the etymology, again, I was trying to think of a way that we could justify having multiple words for child, and have a word in this instance that effectively comes from a meaning of child that doesn't infringe on the word that we already have for child. And it occurred to me, I think a pretty cool source for that would be if it came from a nominalized verb that meant to be born, so the nominalization would essentially be the thing that is born from, which again very nicely fits our meronymic resultative meaning, but it also makes perfect sense as a diminutive and in personal names, gives us a very wide scope of possibilities to use for this affix. So if matu was originally a verb, and assuming it survives into the modern language, then the principal parts for that would be matuhin, the h would cause gemination. Actually, that's an interesting point. I was going to say that the u is lost, and the adjective t followed by the h turns into a geminate, but can you have geminate adjectives? I don't think I've ever seen that before. Matu. I mean, I guess you can. Okay, well, going with that for the time being, I would turn that into a geminate adjective, and that's happened after vowel lowering is already a thing, so that I wouldn't lower, and then umlaut would give us mittin as the modern form. Second principal part is easy. The adjective lowers the u to an o, and then vowel harmony later reduces that to an a, and then the final vowel is lost. So matar. Third principal part, we get vowel loss between the t and the s, word final vowel loss, we get metathesis, we get epenthesis, and we get rhoticization, so marat. And then finally the imperative, the a would disappear, nasal assimilation, final u would lower, so we'd get sunto, which does feel a bit weird to have the imperative be so noticeably different from the other forms, but I don't know, we'll leave it like that for now. And then if the original meaning is to be born, specifically, I could very easily see that bleaching incense to come about, or to appear, or to come into existence. In the same way in English you can say something like, this is the birth of a new age, and I suspect that'll be a fairly common verb too. And it also occurs to me, actually, it would seem likely that that meaning could be causativized, and in that case it's very easy to work out the principal parts, because the causative endings are pretty predictable. Okay, and for one last bit of follow-up, I never got around to settling on a form for this abstract suffix last time, and I mused vaguely about maybe having it come from a word that means place or something similar, which would give us a weird sort of overlap where it can simultaneously be used as an abstract noun but also describe the place where something happens, which maybe there's something to that idea, maybe that could be interesting. But actually, I think I've come up with a better idea. I was thinking it could come from a word that means something along the lines of stuff, or matter, or material, or something. Because if you want to say something like the strength of the tiger, you're saying that there is something about this tiger that is strong. So it's like the part, or the aspect, or the element of the tiger that is strong. And specifically with the word stuff or matter, it gives the impression that like the substance or like the makeup of the tiger is made out of strong stuff, if you see what I mean. It's kind of tricky to articulate, but it seems very natural to me that a word like stuff would give rise to an ending that basically means ness. And we could totally leave it at that if we wanted to. Like a generic word for stuff or substance would work totally fine. But I was thinking just for an extra little degree of flavor, we could use a word for a specific type of building material. I mean, I don't know exactly what sort of building material would make the most sense for a culture living in a sort of cold, alpine environment, but I was thinking of something like plaster, or like, this is where my knowledge of engineering fails me, whatever sort of thing you use to build walls out of, like mud brick, I guess? So originally this would have been used specifically to describe inanimate, or like things that are specifically constructed. The strength of the house would be like the strong walls, or the strong foundation, or the strong timbers of the house. But then that got metaphorically extended into everything else. Or it doesn't even necessarily have to relate to like building materials. It could be something like clay, maybe as an allusion to, the mythical concept of how living things are sculpted from clay. So like the strength of the tiger would be literally the strong clay of the tiger, the strong substance from which the tiger is sculpted. So I still haven't decided on a specific lexical source, but stuff will do fine for the meantime. And in terms of its form, I was thinking something like micro, which would give us a modern form mic. And this word, as far as I can immediately think, would always be inanimate. Doesn't really make sense to talk of an abstract noun as being like a human or an animal or something. Kind of the point is that it's supposed to be a nebulous, inanimate thing. And if that's the case, then I realize actually, as soon as I say this, I realize that in order to justify that word final Q, that final vowel would have to be an A, because as I've sort of arbitrarily decided, in the inanimate, the final A blends with the I of the class suffix into a sort of mid-A, which then gets lost later. So we end up with a word final uvula. And I have said at least once before that I was wary of word final uvulas, because to me they give a very strong Inuit sort of vibe, which I didn't want to overly lean on. But that doesn't mean that we can't have word final uvulas at all. In fact, I don't think we have any word final uvulas up until this point, so I'm looking for a wider range of word final coders anyway, because so many of our words end in R, or S, or N. So let's throw a Q in there for some variety. And I know we just coined this mat suffix, which also begins with M, but for reasons that I can't fully explain, the M just felt right. I tried it with some other consonants, and I just didn't like the sound of them as much, so we're going with mic. But the really cool thing about this, at least for me, is that since this suffix comes from a word that means stuff, then yes, we can totally use it as just a general abstract word that just means ness, but it also only makes sense that this would be used to describe the substance from which the noun is made. So if we take a random adjective, just because it's at the top of mind, let's go with nilla, which is the word that means child or young. Then we stick this mik suffix at the end. We get nilamik, and that means the child stuff or the young stuff, which would basically be like youth or childhood. But equally, if we take a noun, something like osto, which is tree, and use the same suffix, then I guess that could be translated as like treeness, like the quality of being a tree, but more literally and etymologically, it would mean the stuff of the tree, the thing that the tree is made of, in other words, wood. And I personally think that's really cool, because like nakachti has an affix that means the substance of such and such as well. But again, it's not necessarily interesting to just come up with a separate affix for every single possible sense you can think of. The sort of, I hesitate to say skill of it, but the fun, certainly, is in the balancing act between having a wide variety of derivational affixes that overlap in meaning at certain points, but also give multiple different possible senses based on context. Getting that sort of ideal murkiness is really what we're after. So I'm very happy with that. And one more example that just occurs to me that I think is also pretty fun. If we take the word mir, which means tongue or language, as in the name of the language, tak for mir, sticking on the mik ending, we get mirmik, and that means the stuff that language is constructed out of, the underlying substance of language, which I think is a pretty cool word for grammar. I'm not sure if I have a word for grammar in any of my other languages, maybe in Akashti, I can't remember. It's always been a dream of mine to come up with words for specific grammar terms within the language itself, like to have a word in the language that means nouns, verbs, auxiliaries, all that stuff. Never quite gotten to that point, but this is certainly a sort of a step in that direction, so I quite like that. Okay, now that that's done, the actual thing that I want to talk about today is intensives. So I've alluded to intensives at several points before. Now, every language will have a way of making a more intense version of a verb or an adjective. Like every language will have a word that means like very or to an extreme degree. It's just a question of how that information is packaged. Okay, so first of all, we have to think about this for both verbs and adjectives, because you can say something like, the house is very big, and intensify the adjective, or there actually isn't really a consistent way of doing this in English with verbs. I guess really works a lot of the time. Like you can say, I really tried, or I really want a sandwich. Pretty much most verbs, if you put really in front of them, it means you do it to a great extent. Now, in terms of lexical sources for intensives, there's a couple of likely categories. Number one is a word that means true, which is the predominant strategy in English, since the word very is transparently related to the Latin word vera, which means true, which also gives us like veracity and verification and other words to do with truth. So if something is very big, it is truly big, which in and of itself can also be used as an intensive. And then the other big one, really, is very obviously just the word real with an adverbial ending. So if something's really big, it is in reality big. So it just gets across this sense of, this isn't an exaggeration, it is in fact big. And that same sort of transformation is currently happening with the word literally. If you say, the house is literally gigantic, it means it's gigantic without exaggeration. So that seems to be a very common one. Another one that I have used probably a little too much before, certainly in the Thracian languages, a verb that means to die. Like, again, in English, if you do something to death, that means you've done it a lot. So like in Nakashti and Edun, the intensive just comes from an old word that means death, just incorporated straight into the verb. And in Nakashti, you can also use the word to die just in a basic converb construction. So to do something dyingly means to do it to an extreme degree. Number 3, according to the World Lexicon of Grammaticalization, apparently a word that means bad can sometimes give rise to intensives, and I guess I can see that, especially in words that already have some sort of negative connotation. So you take a word like break, and say if you badly break something, then that means you really shattered it or disintegrated it. And then finally, reduplication. And again, I think that one is pretty obvious. I didn't just break it, I broke it. I really smashed it. Okay, in terms of ways that those could be marked, option 1 is to just have a particular intensive adverb, something that means very or really. Pretty simple and easy to justify, if not ever so slightly a bit boring. Now we could have that adverb as a separate word, or we could say what began life as an adverb ultimately affixed on to the word that it was describing. Option 3, and this would only really make sense in the context of verbs, if it came from an auxiliary or serial verb construction. So like just using die as an example, if you wanted to say, I ran really hard, or I sprinted, then that could be framed as, I died runningly, or I died in the manner of running. So that would ultimately manifest as a separate verb form, kind of like what we have with the causative, where there's like a suffix that generates a whole new set of principal parts. And then finally, if we use reduplication, then that sort of takes care of itself. So like I said, we have to think about this for both adjectives and verbs, and if the adjectives in this language came from verbs, then we could very likely justify just porting over everything that we decide for verbs onto adjectives and just say it works in the same way. But we do not have verb-like adjectives, we have noun-like adjectives. So that means there is no guarantee that the intensive strategies for verbs and adjectives will be the same. I'm actually going to start by thinking about the adjectives because I reckon that will be a bit easier. Because for one thing, that just means that this auxiliary/serial verb construction just wouldn't work for an adjective. That would only make sense in the context of verbs. So that already limits our options. And don't ask me why, but the idea of having a specific affix that goes on adjectives to indicate intensity just doesn't really appeal to me. We totally could do something like that, like what happens in Latin or what is inherited in Italian, where the issumus ending can attach to an adjective to just mean very much such and such. But for whatever reason, I'm just not feeling that here. So realistically, that means our only option is a separate adverb. So if it's an adverb, we could say the source for the adverb was either originally a noun or originally a verb, because we have ways of turning both of those into adverbs. If it's a verb, we just use one of the converb forms, and if it's a noun, we just use the da suffix that we coined a few episodes ago. So first of all, we do already have a word for to die. So this word here, vern, the first principal part, it means dyingly, or while dying, or in the manner of dying. So I guess we could just say that's our intensive word. But number one, as I say, I've already used to die as an intensive word before, and I kind of want to do something different. And I think I am actually leaning towards having it come from a noun root, just to get more use out of our da ending, and because, these principal parts, especially the first principal part, shows up all the time anyway. So we could just have a noun that means, like, truth, and then with the adverb ending it will be truly. Now, I suppose this is as good a time as any to discuss another idea I've had. Can't remember how long ago I had this idea, but I've been wanting to use this for a while. And that is the idea of a specific negative intensive. In other words, something that means very much not, which is different from not very much, by the way. Like, it's a word that means very, but it only shows up in negative statements. And I actually got this idea from thinking about French, because French has discontinuous negation. Like, in French, if you wanted to say something like, I don't like cheese, you can't just say, je n'aime fromage. That is an incomplete utterance, because you have to throw in this word pas as well, je n'aime pas. Because ostensibly this ne element that's getting elided into m, which is to like, the ne is the negative bit, but you also need this other negative bit, pas, in order to complete the phrase. So basically, whenever you have a negative statement, you need these two negative elements. And where that comes from, this word pas, I can't remember what the specific source word is, but I know it's a shortening of a word that means to step, I think. I'm pretty sure it's cognate with the English word pass. So it's sort of like, if we were to kind of approximate this in English, it would be kind of like saying, I don't like one step cheese, or like, I don't like cheese one bit. So originally this pas element would have effectively been an intensifier, but one that's only ever used in the negative, and then it just got used so much that it became mandatory in all negative utterances. Now, I definitely don't want discontinuous negation for this language, because we've already worked out how negatives work, but perhaps this language is on the way to discontinuous negation. So there's two parallel words for very, one for positive polarity and one for negative polarity. So I guess thinking about it actually, the closest English equivalent would be the phrase at all, because you can't say the house is big at all. That doesn't mean anything, but you can say the house isn't big at all. So something along those lines. So I'm trying to think of some sort of nominal meaning that could be adverbialized to get a specifically negative meaning. Okay, I've just had a thought. So another way you can kind of do this negative intensive thing in English is by saying something like not even slightly, or not hardly, or something like that. As in, you pair the negative with a word that means a little bit. So if we had an adjective that meant to be light, and that makes me think could use the word heavy for the positive intensive, and that actually works quite well because my mind immediately goes to, in English, the word grave, as in the adjective, not the noun. I don't actually know if grave as a noun and grave as an adjective are related. I think they might not be, because grave, like if someone is in grave danger, grave comes from gravis, which in Latin means heavy, like heavy or serious, which is also where the word gravity comes from. Okay, I do like heavy for the regular intensive, but light for the negative intensive. It occurs to me that I don't think there's anything that would preclude that from being used in a positive sentence. You could still say something like, the house is a little bit big, or the house is slightly big, in which case this word could still very well be used for something like that. Ideally, I want something that would only make sense to appear in a negative statement. But we can still totally use this as a word that means slightly, as a de-intensifier, I guess it would be called. I don't actually know what the specific word is. Well, one example of something like that would be the word any in English kind of behaves like that. Like you can say, I see someone, but you don't really say, I don't see someone. You say, I don't see anyone. I don't actually know how specific to English that is, but in any case, if we had a word like any, could we just turn that into a straight-up adverb to get a word like anily, I guess? As in any way? Like, the house isn't big in any way. Like, that wouldn't make sense to say in a positive statement. The house is big in any way. So it could just be any, or if need be, we could put a word like part or piece in there. Not in any part is the house big. Yeah, I like that. That's good. Now, using any does kind of lean into indefinites, which is a whole separate topic that might require some more thought later on. But for now, let's proceed with what we've got. So any or all of these will take the da suffix. So if the stem ends with a vowel, then the suffix will just be a d. But if it ends in a compatible consonant, then it will form a cluster and it'll come out as da. So thinking about possible consonant clusters, we don't have very many nd clusters yet, so that's an option. I also think we could probably use some more diphthongs, so something like ida is kind of nice. The only other sounds that could come in a coda position before a D would be an R and an L, and I don't like either of those. I am endeavouring to insert vowels other than A whenever I get the opportunity, because I feel like we're relying on A a little bit too much. But I really do like the I diphthong there, like oido, or oide, or oide, just doesn't sound as good. See, I want this word to begin with a consonant, but running through the options, I don't really like any of them. I think honestly the one I like the most is kaida, although I am wary of overusing the uvula, and that does kind of make it sound like kind of. Kaida, kinda, which is a degree word in English, and I don't like that. Haida is okay. I mean, it's also the name of a Native American language spoken in the Pacific Northwest, but that's fine, I think. Okay, going with haida for now. If we were to use a vowel final stem, I know I said earlier that I think we have too many R's, but I do like the RK cluster, like arkad, or to use a different vowel, irkad, or maybe iskad. We don't have too many SK clusters, and I think I'm okay with that one not having an initial consonant. I think iskad is fine. As I say, I am slightly hesitant to assign a phonological form to this one just yet, because it's composed of possibly 3 different elements. I guess we can at least allude to this now, even if we don't act upon it until a later episode, but... So, for certain classes of words, I can't even think if there's a specific term that encompasses all of them, it is cross-linguistically quite common for words like any, or some, or no, or none. When taking these words and deriving them into indefinite nouns, things like anyone, or someone, or no one, or nothing, or something, or anything, etc., it's cross-linguistically very common for those to be built off of the WH interrogative words. Like, I know for a fact that Navajo does this. The word for no one in Navajo is the negative word attached to the word who. So literally no who. There are other strategies and other variations you can have, but that is a pretty common overall pattern. And in turn, those interrogative words that these are based on, who, what, when, where, etc., I mean, the easiest and most intuitive way to derive those is to have a general word that means something along the lines of what, and then just affix on generic nouns. So like, what place gives you where, and what time gives you when, etc. So coming up with the word any that's used in the negative intensifier, we have to make sure it's compatible with all of that. And I don't think we have the time to confront that today. So let's just take the 2 forms that we do have, and just assign them to our intensive and de-intensive, if you want to call it that. And I think I'm almost arbitrarily going to say that haida is our word that means very, and isked is our word that means a little bit. So the protoforms for that would be something like hai, which I actually think we already have. Yeah is giving rise to our comitative, causative, applicative thing. Okay, well we can't do that then. We'll stick a voiced uvula in there, and that should do the trick. Still might change that initial consonant later, but that can be fixed relatively easily. And then isked, hishuku, and then the da gets added on later to both of them. And then both of these also become just regular adjectives as well. Okay, those are all the different forms for both of those adjectives. Give me a second to apply sound changes. Okay, I'm gonna be honest, I have no idea what's going on here in the singular for this word. Because once the voiced uvula drops out in the early stage, it just devolves into this horrible mess of vowels and glides, and I'm really not sure how that would resolve. Because as it is, we end up with this horrible sort of irregular mess. I'm probably going to have to go back and tweak that at some point. But unfortunately we don't have time for that right now. But now that we've coined those 2 adjectives, that is a perfect segue into our final example sentence. So I want to use both of our degree words, our intensive and our de-intensive. And also, I've been thinking about this, we haven't actually used passives and applicatives that much. I want to showcase our valency changing operations a bit more. And also our 2 new derivational affixes as well, the meronymic and the abstract substantive, whatever you want to call it. So something that immediately comes to mind for that last one is, I know we have a word for rock, so we could derive a word that means stone, as in the substance. Looking through our verbs, we could take the word to live, then put a locative applicative on it to mean to live in, or to inhabit, and then passivize that to mean to be inhabited by. Okay, so what is it that is inhabited? Presumably a place. If we use our word for stone here, so like a stone building, or a stone temple, to get one of our degree words in, what adjectives do we have that could describe the stone temple? I guess old would make the most sense. The very old stone temple is inhabited by something that is slightly strong. What would make sense to use as a meronymic suffix here? I don't know why, but I keep going back to fire. So like fireborn, something that has been born from flames. I'm thinking some sort of monster or dragon or something. Now, I'm going to reverse these intensifiers actually. It'll be a slightly old temple and a very strong fireborn, whatever it is. We do have the augmentative that provides a sort of scary or pejorative meaning, although fireborn does make me think of salamanders, because of the myth of salamanders emerging from flames, whereas that's just because the salamanders slept inside the firewood during the winter, then you throw them in the fireplace and set them on fire and the salamanders come crawling out, which makes people think that they were somehow born from the flames. Now, we don't have a word for salamander, but we do have a word for lizard, or just general reptilian creature. How about we use lizard, but use the adjectivizing suffix to turn it into lizard-like things? So, the slightly old stone temple is inhabited by a very strong fire-born lizard-like animal. Okay, first up is the verb. Now, this could be interpreted as either a present or a habitual. It could be that the fire-born lizard-like animal just sort of generally lives in this temple, or it's emphasizing that right now the temple has come under the inhabitants of this creature. I'm just going to go with the present tense. There's form 1 and the first principal part. Very easy. Okay, so this is a passive sentence, which means that the subject is the building, it's the temple. The temple is inanimate. And if this were a true passive, or an impersonal passive, as in there's no reference to the agent, if we were just saying the temple is inhabited, then we would use harat. But because there's an agent, we use the other passive construction. So it is, so it's just this long E vowel as the auxiliary. Then the word to live. First principal part is vettin, but we stick on the combination of the locative applicative and the passive. So that's a tam prefix. Now that brings up the question, when this prefix is applied, does the V in vettin stay as a V? Because that's only happening because of word initial fortition. I think that would remain as a W, which, when there's an MW sequence, that results in a geminate M. So we get demettin. That's a long vowel sandwiched between two geminates. Okay, then the slightly old stone temple. Nominative of temple is aikaduk. Stone is irni, and sticking on the abstract ending, irnimik. And it needs to agree in number and case, but it already does that because they're both singular nominative. And then slightly old. Slightly is iskred. Inanimate nominative for old is kulke. Then we introduce the agent of the passive, which is done with the dative case. So lizard is vahar, but as we discussed earlier, appending it with the adjectivizing suffix happens before word final vowels are lost, and if that vowel isn't lost, then the H and the R cluster together. So the nominative of lizard-like animal would be vahraha, and then with the animate dative would be vahrahar. Okay, then we need fireborn. Fire is sichva, then the ending is mat, but it needs to be in the dative, which again is just an R ending. And then very strong. The word very is always just haida, because it's an adverb, it doesn't inflect for case. But then strong also needs to be in the dative, which is baradar. Okay, I think that's the whole thing. So we get Iskud kulke irnimik aikaduk, I haida baradar sichvamatar vachravar temöttin. That's a lot of R suffixes, but of course this is a somewhat artificial example, because we're piling so many adjectives onto this thing. Okay, and that's where we're going to call it for today. I go now to return to my labours, and hopefully by the time this video actually comes out, the end will not be too far off. So assuming I don't die before that point, looking forward to seeing you all then, and celebrating the end of alien biospheres. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the other side.